Welcome back to episode 2 of the Training Science Summaries. This is a podcast series that Dan and I do monthly now, where we essentially break down physiology research into really actionable pieces to enable daily performance for our listeners. So Dan, today we've got 3 to 4 studies we're going to go through. 3 to 4? Yeah, the shot clock is we're going to try and do these in about 8 to 10 minutes. A few of them maybe, higher or less. Episode 1, I think we got through those pretty nicely. One of the takeaways I personally took is I need to speak less, and I want to hear from you. So we're going to dive straight into it, picking up where we left off last week with durability. You summarized this study in the idea of how durable are you really? And I know the study and the premise of it was a durability index for endurance exercise. And essentially it was a methodology consideration on how people can start to test durability for themselves at home.
Exactly. So it was an opinion piece. Well, in academia we call this like an opinion piece, where it's not really a research project, as in you've got methods, results and conclusions. It's more about experts get together and they talk about how you can possibly use something that's actionable. And in this particular instance, it was looking at how we can measure durability. And it's a bit of a tricky concept because you can really measure it in the lab, which is quite, obviously it's the best way, but not everyone can get into the lab. It's expensive to do. It's very time consuming. So they were just talking about ways where you can, for any endurance athlete out there who wants to measure the durability, what could they possibly do? So just to recap, like durability, it's basically, we're looking at how thresholds change over time, right? So we're looking at, okay, what's your aerobic threshold at the start? We're going to ride for 2-3 hours at a set intensity. Then we're going to say, how much does that change? And the more durable athlete has a less of a change in how that threshold changes over time. And that's what we're trying to assess. So by default...
I'll slow you down there really quickly. If anyone who hasn't listened to episode 1, this concept of durability is very much around the aerobic threshold elements of performance, less about injury and building kind of robust athletes is what we talked about last week.
Yeah, so it can be aerobic threshold. It could be anaerobic threshold or VT1, VT2. But by default, therefore, we should be measuring thresholds. But what we found in some of our other durability studies is that when we measure performance at the same time, so we might look at change in threshold, but then we also look at performance. There seems to be a very close relationship between how much your threshold changes and how your performance changes. So those who have are the least durable, so they did a 5-minute time trial the least durable athletes would also see a bigger decrement in their 5-minute time trial post. So therefore, what this study is saying that you can do things with lactate, for example, but a good way to do it is possibly by doing like a 5-minute time trial, for example, 2 to 3 hours of clamped exercise, and we'll get back to that and why that bits. There's a few nuances in that, and then another 5-minute time trial performance. Then you can see how that changes over time. And as you become more durable, your 5-minute power, for example, might be 300 watts at the start. You do it the first time, it might drop to 250. But then if you improve your durability, it should stay closer to 300, for example.
Can I break? So the 5-minute time trial, 5-minute time period, meters in 5 minutes. What's it measuring?
Well, you could do it. It depends what you're doing. Like if it's rowing, cycling, whatever it might be. Running, you could do. So you could basically, if it was running, you'd see how the distance you cover in 5 minutes. So total distance.
It's a max test.
Max test, yeah, pretty much. How far you can go in 5 minutes. You could also do it you could try and estimate how long you're going to, you could say a 2K time trial, like, around 6 minutes, 6-7 minutes, you can try and get close to that. But in cycling, you generally do average power output. So what's your average power output over the first 5 minutes, average power output over the second 5 minutes?
So for a lot of people then, obviously running, very accessible. So you could do the 5-minute test while running, or potentially 5-minute test if they've got access to a rower, if they've got access to a stationary bike, if they've got access to a road bike if they wanted. Would you do a 5-minute test on an assault bike? Would you do it on
You could do, but I mean, I don't think those sorts of athletes are that interested in durability, right? Okay. It's more endurance-based athletes, so I think the assault bikes are probably more for your short intensity. But before we finish on that, what's really key is that you can test your durability. Another way that they talked about is looking at, if you haven't got the testing, you can look at what we call decoupling. So that's a change in when you're measuring the internal load versus the external load. So that might be your internal load is heart rate, respiration rate, something like that. and then the internal load would be power output. So like someone who's more durable, they stay very tightly and close together throughout that 2 hour, 3 hour period. But if you're less durable, what we tend to see is we see a decoupling effect where power would be, say, constant 260 watt, but the heart rate gradually increases. And that's generally a sign because your thresholds have dropped. So you're going over kind of what we say that moderate intensity exercise is. You're going into more of a severe exercise. And then you generally get drifts in your cardiorespiratory physiology. And that's where you can see that decoupling. And then the other thing is that when you are deciding that the durability point when you're trying to go for 2-3 hours, you want to clamp that, and it's best to clamp it not as a percentage of max, but clamp it around a threshold. So as percentage of if you think your aerobic thresholds, say 250 watts or whatever it might be, you want to do it as a percentage of that, not as a percentage of a maximal, because that can be quite problematic.
So the study basically talked people through a way to be able to measure that away from a lab. The 5-minute test was one. Summarizing what other tests were.
And then the other one would be looking at your decoupling that we just talked about.
Okay.
Yeah, between the internal load and the external load.
Okay, so essentially they set up those two protocols, and what did they find?
Yeah, well, it depends on which one there wasn't really protocols, I guess. It was more talking about ways you can measure it. Both are effective. If you are going to be doing the more time trial based one, you want to make sure that you do control for various factors like clamping the exercise around a specific threshold, making sure your eating is the same every time. So if you're taking carbohydrates or not, so maybe you don't want to take 30 grams per hour one time and 60 grams the next and none the next. That's important to consider. And then the other one would be heat. So you want to make sure the temperature is the same.
Is relatively constant.
Yeah.
And so that's across both studies.
Yeah.
So in all that the studies showed that both studies were equally effective.
Well, they weren't studies. They were just it's an opinion piece talking about different ways you can measure durability. It didn't really say which one's better. Okay. It's just, I guess.
Well, speaking of opinion, which one's better?
Well, I would say that probably it's easier to get more data from just looking at your physiological decoupling. Because otherwise you have to do the test, where you can probably look at your physiological decoupling in many, many exercise sessions that you do, and that's the best. And if you go into something like Training Peaks, they actually give you a decoupling score, which is like as a percent. So a higher, it'll say power to heart rate, and a higher percentage, it might be 10%, 12%, is a high decouple rate, and then it might be 2-3% low decouple rate. So you can actually use that in Training Peaks, for example, to easily ascertain whether you're getting more or less durable. If you just do like a set 30-minute, 1 hour piece, set power output, pretty simple.
So both protocols effective, but one of the things people should be aware of is to make sure all outside mediums, nutrition, fueling are the same.
Yeah, if you're doing the 5-minute test. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Nice feedback. Good segue. I think that leads us into a nice topic that we've going to speak about on the back of last week again, is trying to find ways for people to be able to measure what you guys essentially measure in labs, being able to bring it out of the lab into home. The next way was obviously spoken about before, was trying to find, if you don't have, the data or the tools to be able to work out what your thresholds were, the next study was effectively talking about this concept of VO2, essentially talking about the talk test.
Yeah, to assess your thresholds.
Yeah, exactly. And so this study, which is an interesting one. You've called it how effective is the talk test at trying to find your different thresholds. Physiological. The study was essentially physiological drift during steady state exercise based on incremental talk test.
Yeah. And it was a really good one. So the talk test is being used a lot to try and see if it's effective at. So if we backtrack a little bit, when we prescribe exercise and we do training zones, for example, we get people into the lab and we try and ascertain two distinct demarcations of exercise intensity, two physiological demarcations. So the one would be your aerobic threshold, also known as VT1, lactate 10.1, and the second one is what people would call your anaerobic threshold. So you'd compare, one is like when you go from moderate to like heavy exercise domain, and then it goes heavy to severe. So think about like the VT1 would be more like, it's close to marathon pace, probably a little bit easier than marathon pace for a lot of people. It's almost close to Ironman pace, so it's quite light. But then the second one is more like your 10K, like 1 hour, what you do for an hour. So it's a little bit more intensive, but that's how we just prescribe training. That's how your level 2's decided that we talked about last week. So level 2 is your VT1, your aerobic threshold.
Yeah.
So that's the end of it. So anything below, like just below your aerobic threshold is known as level 2. But it's really hard to ascertain or to get your VT1 easily without going to the lab. And that's what this study is talking about. It's like, how can we establish VT1 or the aerobic threshold in the talk test? Because it's a really important threshold to know for training prescription, like when you do level 2 training, for example.
So to summarize that then, what should people look for in the talk test to identify that point?
Yeah.
Because are you saying that the study showed that it was rather difficult to
No, the study showed it was very good. So what the study did is they made exercises do an incremental test where they increase the intensity every time, and then they tried to have 3 different points. So point 1 was last positive -1, which was the last stage before speaking became noticeably more difficult. Okay, so that's stage 1. And then they did another one that was the last positive, which was the final stage where participants could still speak comfortably.
Yeah.
So, and then the last one was the point at which, what's it called, the equivocal, which is the point where they were no longer confident in their ability to talk continuously. So that's what you had to mark. And then what they did is they made them exercise continuously at these 3 points, and they measured all of their physiological variables. So the point at where your LT1 is, you shouldn't see a drift in exercise heart rate or exercise VO2. You shouldn't get something called this slow rise in your physiology, which is we talked about before, that decoupling effect. And what they found was that the last positive stage -1, so the last stage before speaking became noticeably more difficult. They had very stable physiology. Yeah, so what they did what was quite different is that after they went through all these and they kind of got the intensities where the talking changed, so the LP1 and the LP, and then what they called the EQ, they then looked at how their physiology changed over time when they were just exercising continuously. And what they found was the LP1, which was the last stage before speaking, became noticeably more difficult. Physiology was very, very stable, which would suggest that is around the LT1 or lactate turn point first aerobic threshold. But then once they made them do it again at the intensity where the final stage where participants could still speak comfortably, they found it a bit more difficult, but it wasn't quite as comfortable for them. So
in practical terms, I think we had that this morning. A couple of our team members, there was 4 of us going on a run this morning. Jared, who's behind the camera, great runner, and then we have 2. There's myself, not so much a great runner, and then we've obviously got two guys in the team that can, are borderline or are budding professional triathletes. And this morning we were going on a run, very light pace for them. I was kind of running between 4:30, 4:45 pace. So for me, that's up there. And it was a 4-way conversation in our jog. And it started off, very much everyone was having their piece of the conversation, and I was very quick to drop off being part of the conversation because it just got to the point where it was like, I'd prefer to concentrate on breathing than talking.
Exactly. So your other participants would have been at the point where, below that first threshold, where physiology was stable, right? So they didn't have that gradual drift in their cardiorespiratory, the breathing, the heart rate. Whereas because you were slightly over your threshold, you were probably slightly above your VT1 or your aerobic threshold, you gradually got that drift. And at the start you were fine, but of course it drifts and drifts up, and then your breathing gets more labored, your heart rate gets up, and it gets harder and harder to speak. So, how can people take this practically? We've actually published a blog on Endure IQ where we suggested the talk test is a great way where you can actually just almost increase your exercise intensity and have a paragraph of a book and read it out loud and see the point at where you can no longer do it comfortably. And that's probably very close to where your aerobic threshold is.
Can you give me your opinion? Did you see the piece this week? It was a grab in Geraint Thomas's. Did you see his recent podcast grab? But he was saying in a recent race, I can't remember which race it was. Obviously, race starts uphill in Belgium.
Yeah. Tour of Flanders or something.
Yeah, I can't remember which race it was, but anyway, starts at a pretty heavy incline, and Pogačar comes up behind him and just just starts talking to him. And he goes, I look down at my meter and he goes, we're doing 420 watts. And he goes, he's asking me about what we're doing tomorrow. He says he's looking to buy a new watch. And Geraint Thomas was saying, like, I was, you know, I was okay, I was comfortable, but at the same time, I kind of gave him that look, like, I really just want to concentrate on breathing here. But he was so comfortable talking, and if he kept engaging in the conversation, you know, Tade would have continued right. And he just put that down on the podcast, saying the guy is at another level right now. I think like also, at 420 watts, happy to have a conversation.
Yeah, but it's also like, you think about the mindset of the competitive edge that you can have if you're like in a group, or you're like, even when you're doing a marathon in an Ironman and you're next to someone and then you start having a chat with them and you show them, you're showing them that you're okay. You're showing them that you're fine. Do
you think there was a bit of foxing in there then?
I reckon there could be a bit of foxing, yeah.
Absolutely.
Why not?
Yeah, why not? I agree.
I mean, it would, I mean, if you can show someone how comfortable you are, you don't know.
Exactly. You know? So it takes us back. That talk test, you know, it can be used in a lot of ways, but good summaries on that. And we're going to dive into a topic which I'm sure a lot of people are quite interested in. A lot of people have probably started to take up this protocol, and that's cold plunging or ice bathing. And this was from the European Sports Science Journal from Piñero et al. And it was titled Throwing Cold Water on Muscle Growth, a systematic review in a meta-analysis of the effects of post-exercise cold water immersion on resistance training. So I know you have been an ice bather for a long time.
I was myself an ice bath.
Absolutely, and you would know a lot about this topic naturally. Explain what the study was looking into and what some takeaways are in it.
Yeah. Well, where to begin with this? So I guess we'll go back to the end of we'll talk about more about ice bath and beyond muscle growth and stuff like that, right? Because there's more benefit than just muscle growth. But this study looked just at muscle growth. Okay. Yeah. So there was a historic study, or a landmark study, as we'd like to call it, that showed that a particular molecular pathway called mTOR was significantly blunted when you use cold water. Okay, which was mTOR, which is so. And Keith Barr, I remember when Keith Barr came on the Pillar Performance podcast, he talked a bit about mTOR because he was one of the main guys who discovered that there was a direct relationship between, if you measured muscle growth in two individuals, and there was a direct relationship between how much someone grew and how much mTOR activation was in that person. So say you and me went through an exercise protocol of strength, you would probably get bigger than me, but you would have a lot more mTOR activation than me, for example.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's, but that was kind of one study that everyone talked about. It started this off, but what this new study did is it reviewed 15 different studies. It reviewed 8 different studies. Yeah, it reviewed eight different studies. And it looked at the effects of whether it, overall did it actually show that there was a reduction in muscle growth. And lo and behold, there is a general trend to show that if you do cold water immersion directly after exercise, and that's within 15 minutes, you will blunt some of the muscle growth gains that you were possibly getting. So if muscle growth is your thing, you don't want to be doing cold water immersion directly after strength training.
And it's a really interesting finding, because now in a lot of the modern fitness settings, particularly here in Australia, I can see a lot going in that direction in North America as well. Europe still hasn't realised that the recovery and wellness element can very much be combined in a gym setting like we're in today. And I think I see a lot of people in my local gym, they will go straight from doing what I would deem a form of hypertrophy session. Everyone in the gym these days seems to be doing 8 to 15 reps. No one I really see going for 1 or 2 RMs unless they're in high performance programs. And then almost immediately they're in the ice bath. Yeah. And then after the ice bath, they're in the sauna. And they do kind of compartmentalize those two processes. It's like, oh, well, I've kind of finished training now, but now I'm going to do my recovery protocols, but don't actually realize the window they're doing them in. If they are looking for muscle growth, which, you know, as a body comp goal, a lot of people are, not realizing that this study's actually shown that it can blunt some of the hard work that they're doing. Yeah.
We mentioned the sauna, and the sauna could actually have the opposite effect. It could actually enhance some of the mTOR. Enhance it. So, like, you know, if you are going to do something after, I wouldn't say it's a recovery. Like sauna gets clamped into this kind of recovery area, but I think if it's more of an enhancer, or even a training session within itself. like 20 minutes in the sauna, 80 degrees, you get a lot of cardiorespiratory benefits from that. You can sit there with a heart rate of 100, you can get great activations of your heat shock proteins, great blood plasma volume expansion, which they're all endurance adaptations. So they're quite different things. But with this study, one thing that it didn't consider was, okay, well, what about, that's within 15 minutes, what happens if I came back 4 hours later, if I came back 5 hours later? I think the half-life of mTOR is about 8 hours. So, if you came back 8 hours later and did your cold water,
what would the results be? Yeah,
it might be quite different. And cold water immersion, one of the main things that it's shown to improve is your it's like we talked about, is your parasympathetic reactivation, so your autonomic nervous system side. So necessarily doing cold water immersion after you're doing something that's quite ATP short, heavy, doesn't really make that much sense. But if you're doing something that's quite glycolytic, where there's a high sympathetic component, so like in the high rep range, or like a WOD or something like that, that makes a bit more sense. So I don't think you necessarily want to be going and hitting the cold water immersion after you do a heavy strength session either, So
yeah, and I can certainly see, as you said, you identified immediately that the next stage of this study needs to be, okay, if it's the 15-minute window post hypertrophy training for muscle growth to be not ideal. Yeah. At what point in time would it make sense? Because I think a lot of people who are looking to build muscle would still see ice bathing and and even sauna, for example, as a part of their day. Yeah. Would they be comfortable to come back at the end of the day to be able to get the results? That would be a great study.
I think that would be a really great way to do it. And also, though, you can think of this as a tool in your toolbox to take in and take out, because I know there's many endurance athletes who are probably listening.
Absolutely,
Well, that's great. I don't want to put any muscle. If this training is supplementary to your main work, and you've got a hard run or something that's more important, like for a triathlete, for example, or a runner or a cyclist, the strength training is not the most important thing. So if you're doing the strength training, but you've got a hard session the next day, then... And
by strength training, you probably also mean strength, but size gain. You almost want the strength without the size gain. And this is the thing, I think I almost want to lead you into this, because it's probably the most important thing we'll talk about today. It's with this study that has found that can occur if you essentially do a very heavy resistance session, that this can stop muscle growth. Not stop, but we know it will lessen the effects. How do you use that to your advantage? Exactly. And you immediately turn to an athlete that is focused more on the strength element or the stimulus element and less on the post-outcome of it. Yeah. Endurance athletes. And we spoke recently, obviously, Dr. Cadro was talking about how to remove any, the excess osmolyte process of creatine on weight gain, just like, strength training, just like you can do that by, obviously spreading out creatine throughout the day to reduce the weight gain. You can do it with strength training.
You can spread out your cold water. If you think about me, when I do strength training now, I don't really do cold water on the same day. Yep. I'll do sauna on the same day, but I'm also not that fussed about getting bigger either. But I don't think cold water immersion is also one of those things that you don't want to do every single day, because as everything gets with it's just dose response relationship, and you need to form some kind of stress there. If you do cold water immersion every single day, it's not a stress anymore. It's too easy. Your body adapts. Yeah. And then you have to get colder and colder, longer and longer. So you want to be in there, not 3 times a week is a great amount of time. Doing it every single day is probably just it can make you feel good. And often I'll jump in if I just need a bit of a pick me up. But there's more to it than just the recovery side. I think you can get a good dopamine response. It makes you feel better. It's great for your blood glucose. Yeah. There's been great studies that show that, if you've got someone who wants to have a big sugary meal, jump in the cold water. Yeah. Brilliant. But some loads of benefits.
Absolutely. Really interesting takeaways. And to summarize the takeaways, if you are very, very focused on trying to gain lean muscle or just gain size, just be very mindful to not ice bath immediately after. It's a really easy protocol to start to follow, particularly now that a lot of gyms and fitness studios are putting wellness and recovery centers next to the weight floor.
And just to finish on that, I know we've talked about this for a long time, but I think it's quite a good topic, is that, there's nothing to say that you can't do it in the morning when you first wake up,
Pre. Yeah.
And then you might even, especially if it's hot, you're in a hot environment, it might actually be beneficial.
I must admit, I've done it a few times, jumped in the ice pre-doing weight. It felt amazing.
Yeah, you feel good.
And it did nothing to, for strength. Some people would say, oh, but then do you start with cold muscles? I know
people who only report gains from it,
Yeah, absolutely. Great. That was a great summary. Final one to round us off for episode 2. It wouldn't be an episode of the Training Science Summaries without a carbohydrate topic.
We'll have a carbohydrate
absolutely.
It could be a fat topic.
Yeah, but this is a topic we're going to just stay on the resistance training theme, essentially helping people or breaking down some fueling ideas around how to fuel with carbohydrates for resistance training, if it's important. Is it as important as other elements? This study by King et al. In the European Journal of Sports Science, again, very recent study, 2020-25, looked into this, and what did they find?
Yeah, so this study was done by my colleagues at AUT University as well. So Eric Helms, who was on the podcast, was one of the authors on this study. So there's been loads of studies that have looked at the effects of carbohydrates on performance, right? But the thing that this group was trying to pull apart was, okay, is that effect on performance just calories, or is it just carbohydrates? So what they did is they had 3 different groups. They had one that was where the calories were from carbohydrates. They had another one where the calories were from other sources like fats and proteins, and then finally a study where it came from just placebo. So there's 3 crossover. So everyone did the same. So everyone effectively were their own control. So it's a brilliant study design, very, very strong study design. And what they did is they gave them in the morning for the breakfast. I think it was like 2 hours, and then they did their performance exercise. And what they found was there was 0 difference between whether you had carbohydrates, no carbohydrates, but the same calories, and some food that had no calories in but was acted as a placebo. I don't know how they did that.
And what were they measuring? They were measuring weight lifted.
Yeah, so they did the
RPE?
Number of reps at 80% of the max. So they looked
so it's purely strength.
How many reps they could do. Okay. And they all did around 7. It was mostly upper body, so like bench press and over the shoulder. And they also looked at lactate and other things like some physiological things. And basically, they didn't find any differences between the carbohydrates weren't magical, but what seems to be it tends to suggest that calories are more important than anything. You want some calories in the system before you start doing your exercise routine. But I will say with this study that one is it was all leg based. All upper body based. So perhaps legs are a bigger muscle group, a bit more glycolytic, a bit more carbohydrate thirsty, so to speak. So maybe if they went and did a load of squats and a load of leg press, we may have seen a bit more of a difference. And also quite a short rep range. So like 7 reps is still quite short. So we are skewing ourselves away from a very, very high glycolytic and carbohydrate dependent energy source. So maybe if we were doing like 20 reps, there might be a difference. So there's a few nuances, but I think for the big take home is that if you're typically a person going to the gym and you're doing like your 5 to 10 rep range, you don't need to be thinking you need to chow down a load of carbohydrates before you do it. Particularly if you're someone who is like a bit insulin resistant or you've got general high blood glucose. Because what they did show is that those who had the high carbohydrates, they had big spikes in blood glucose, but that had no effect on their performance.
On the performance. So. Interesting one, because I think, there is a myth out there, for those potentially going to gym, doing gym training in the morning, doing strength training, everyone goes, okay, if I'm doing an endurance session, then I will take my carbohydrates. If I'm doing a strength session, I won't. Just try and obviously balance their caloric intake for the day. And then sometimes they probably feel, but maybe, when I'm doing a testing day in the gym, I'll load up. But now you're saying that, no, you're actually fine sticking with that protocol probably don't need to.
And I think what's really interesting about this and what could be a good practical takeaway is that, like, for many, many athletes who are in the gym, it's quite hard for them to get the amount of protein that they need. And if you're pre-gym and you're trying to get 200 to 300 grams of proteins per day, you can actually make that a protein-based meal, and you're going to be fine for your performance in the gym. And then you're not stacking all those calories, because sometimes it's just eating too much, eating too much food, and you get too full. So you can actually say, okay, rather than I need to get my 200 to 300 grams of protein, which is my priority, I'm going to have that before my gym. I don't have to have carbohydrates and fill myself up on that. I can have it after, or I can have it before. But cool.
Thanks for that. Some really good takeaways. For anyone there wondering, do you need to fuel for performance in strength training? This study says no, it's not
within that rep range.
Within that rep range, and that I think though is a really interesting one, because push that out to 15 to 20 reps.
Yeah, who knows?
That there, and then if you then maybe RPE'd someone. Yeah. Maybe someone who would hit the 15 feeling significantly better on reps 2 and 3.
Sure. Or it was all on the legs as well. We don't know those answers. But for this
study, for what's in front of us, I liked it. Thank you very much. That's episode 2 wrapped up. I think we've nailed that in 40 minutes.
40 minutes?
I think it was 40 minutes. Dan, nice. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for doing the diving in on these studies with the team. We are hoping that everyone here is understanding, obviously, what exercise physiologists look at, how then Dan translate that research into his practical elements with coaching with athletes. If any of you have any questions, want to get in touch with Dan or the EnduroIQ team as to how they break down research into applicable actions, please get in touch. Show notes across our platforms will be there. See you for episode 3. Thank you.